The psoas attaches to the lumbar spine. It actually attaches to the front of the lumbar spine. It is the only muscle that attaches to the front of the lumbar vertebrae, and so it's possibly quite important in supporting the lower back. So if you have low back pain, the psoas may be one of the main culprits. But anyway, the psoas attaches to the front of the actual bodies of the lumbar vertebrae, but also to the transverse processes. Those are the bits of bones that stick out the side of each vertebrae. So from the side, the psoas passes down and forward to around the front of the pelvis, passing under the inguinal ligament. And then from there it reaches back and attaches to the inner thigh. Static poses, the psoas can also be very helpful if you have psoas control, because in a posture like this, if you find that the front of your thigh gets tired quickly, your rectus femoris, it may be because your psoas isn't activating. And even now I'm shaking a little bit. But with psoas control, exercises like this become a little bit easier. There's also ab control involved in that as well. But if you have good psoas operation, this sort of pose with the leg straight, and this is my bad leg, my right psoas has a little bit of problem, but it's getting better now. And what I feel is before, this muscle here gets tired quickly, and even there I'm shaking a bit. But with improved psoas control, movements like that become easy. The leg comes up, what should happen, according to this idea, is that the psoas fibers actually pull in closer to the spine. Instead of staying like that, they pull in closer. And why would that be beneficial? Because the psoas is the only muscle that attaches to the front of the lumbar vertebrae, it is perhaps critical in maintaining the stability of the lumbar spine. If you get low back pain and the problem is the psoas isn't activating properly, the muscles at the back of your spine, not just the spinal erectors, I forgot the name, but anyway, the muscles that act on the back of your lumbar spine may be trying to contract in an effort to support the lumbar spine because the psoas isn't doing its job. So one structural reason why the psoas might suck in, and I'll go into how it does that in a moment, why it might suck in particularly when the leg is raised, is that when the leg raised, the psoas loses slack. So for a muscle to be able to contract, it has to have a little bit of tension in it. So with the leg raised, the psoas potentially loses that tension, particularly if the upper fibers stretch forward. So by being able to suck into the belly, the psoas still has enough tension both to pull up on the leg, but also to support the front of the lumbar spine. So the idea that I have is that perhaps the fibers that attach to the transverse processes, which are those attachment points are slightly further back, perhaps those fibers act so that when the front of the hip joint is closed, those fibers act to help draw in the psoas towards the lumbar spine. This then makes it possible for the psoas to be useful in a wider or a bigger range of movement. And not only that, if the psoas is sucked in when the leg is raised, it means that it possibly still crosses the front of the pelvis and still acts to press the pelvis back when it is suddenly engaged. But more importantly, if the psoas actually does suck into the lumbar spine, it gives it the room to contract so that it can support the front of the lumbar spine in balance with the muscles at the back of the lumbar spine. The way that I've learned to control the psoas, part of it's through Tai Chi experience, but basically is to focus on feeling or imagining that I can feel my lumbar vertebrae and imagining the lumbar vertebrae being pulled forwards. I've used this technique both doing squats and deadlifts in combination with abdominal contraction, and it seems to be working quite well. Again, the basic steps, if you can feel your lumbar spine, is to focus on contracting or pulling your lumbar spine forward. Depending on what you're doing, the position of your legs, you may find that in some instances, depending on exactly how you activate, your abs may activate. Sometimes I find it, particularly if I'm standing tall, my lower belly pulls in by itself. There are other actions you can do in combination with psoas activation, but I'd say for yoga people, Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha. So when you can feel your lumbar vertebrae, when you can focus on drawing your lumbar vertebrae forward and actually feel like they're being pulled forward. And so I should point, even though you're pulling forward, the lumbar vertebrae aren't actually drawing forward. So the idea is like flexing your arm. You don't actually move the bones of the arms, you just squeeze the bicep and the tricep, but you're not focusing, oh, I've got to keep my arm still. It's sort of like a subconscious intent. You keep your arm still and then you pop your bicep, and what happens is the bicep and tricep both squeeze to keep so that the tricep squeezes as well to counterbalance the bicep, and your arm stays in place. And a similar effect may happen when you focus. So sorry, what I should point out is that I'm not even focused on squeezing the tricep. My focus is slowly on keeping this shape in my arm, squeezing my bicep, and then my tricep activates automatically to keep the arm in place. So with this action, activating the psoas and pulling the lumbar spine forward, my intent is to keep the lumbar spine in place, and is just to create a pulling sensation on either side of the lumbar spine. And you could imagine a pull towards your inguinal ligaments or towards your pubic bone. And I'm just keeping that to keep my psoas engaged, ideally on both sides. I've got a little bit of weakness on my right side, it feels. You could also try moving your hips a little bit, maybe slightly varying the curve of your lumbar spine to see how it feels. And the idea here is, if you can deliberately contract your psoas, you can also relax it. So that's my suggestions for psoas control. First of all, learn how to deliberately contract your psoas by drawing your lumbar spine forward. And then in any exercise you do or any activity, you can play around with activating the psoas or deactivating it. A couple of suggestions for better psoas control is learning Mula Bandha or pelvic floor control. Another one is learning to lengthen the spine as a whole, and yet another exercise is learning to control the transverse abdominis. Thank you very much. Namaste.